Hey guys, Pastor Britton here. We're so thankful that you've decided to watch one of the sermons from our Sunday mornings here at Freedom Fellowship. We hope it's encouraging to you, uplifting to you, challenging to you. We also want to point out that these online sermons are not an adequate substitute for gathering with a body of believers on a regular basis. So we hope you enjoy the sermon, that it's beneficial to you, but at the same time, we hope that you get plugged in at a local church wherever you are. So if you're not plugged in anywhere, we invite you to reach out to us, email us, call us, and reach out to us so that we can plug you in either here at Freedom Fellowship or we can help you get plugged in at a good church wherever you are in your local community. Enjoy the sermon.
We're going to talk about a story out of the Old Testament this morning. How many of you guys like a good story? I think most people like a good story. Just keeps getting bigger and better every time you tell it, right? We won't do that to this one. We don't need to do that to this one. Anybody ever heard of a teenage boy named David and this big, huge monster guy named Goliath? Anybody ever heard? Two people. Okay. Good. This one's a fan favorite, I think. A lot of people know this story. A lot of people love this story. I mean, you talk to people who have never even cracked open a Bible, and a lot of those folks can tell you the basic story of David and Goliath, right? I kind of thought it would be just kind of fun. I was going to just bring Dave and the Giant Pickle this morning and show the Veggie Tale and just call it good, because they work. Try it if you haven't tried it. I have them all. You're welcome to stop by anytime. Check them out. Big Veggie Tale fan. But people make reference to it all the time, right? And typically when people are referencing David and Goliath, what are they talking about? They're talking about a situation where there's an underdog. Usually it's maybe a game or a contest or a sport, usually, whatever. So there's somebody that like shouldn't even be there. They don't have a chance. They don't have a shot. Go on home. Don't even even try, right? And then of course there's the huge heavy favorite, which not the Saints, but anyway. Just saying. No, I'm kidding. I'm just messing with you. A heavy favorite, right? That just everybody knows what's going to happen. You can go to the bank, bet that money. Hopefully you don't do that kind of stuff. For me, when I think of the greatest David and Goliath sports stories of all time, the one that comes to mind for me is the Miracle on Ice. Anybody know what that's a reference to? Hockey game. Yeah, 1980. Winter Olympics, Lake Placid, New York. We were the host country that year. So, of course, that means we had to put a team in the tournament. They kind of thought about doing that for a while because the pickings were kind of slim. Soviet Union was the Goliath. They were the top team. They had won. They were the 4-time defending gold medal champion in the Olympics. I didn't realize that until I kind of looked at some of the details. But 5 out of the last 6 gold medals went to the Soviet Union by the time they got to the 1980 Olympics. They had all professionals on their team. They had tons and tons of international experience. On the other hand, you had the U.S. team that was literally a bunch of amateurs. They had 4 guys on the team that year that had just a little bit of minor league experience, and that was it. It was kind of like, well, we got to put a team in, so here you go. Have a great time. Go play your 2 games and have a nice day. That was the whole attitude, right, for that team that year. They were the youngest team in the tournament by far. They were the youngest team that the U.S. had ever put together for an Olympic Games. So it defined David and Goliath. Well, both teams were in separate group stages, but they both came through their group stages undefeated. Of course, everybody knew the Soviet Union would, but the U.S. actually had some surprising results. They tied Sweden 2-2 that year. That was like a victory for us in that Olympic Games. And then Czechoslovakia was supposed to be the number 2 team that year. They were expected to win the silver medal, and the U.S. beat them handily, 7-3. It's a huge up. I mean, that was a David and Goliath moment right there. Big time upset. So they both, Soviet Union and the U.S., come into the medal round, which is basically the semifinals, undefeated. U.S. has that 1 tie. And for those of you that know hockey, there's 3 periods, right? At the end of the first period, it was 2-2. U.S. was hanging in there. Soviet Union wasn't running away with a match yet. In the second period, the Soviets scored another goal. So at the end of the second period, it was 3-2. But then in the third period, The U.S. scored 2 goals in the first half of that third period to take a 4-3 lead, and then they hung on for the rest of the match, and they stopped. They prevented the Soviets from scoring. They won that match 4-3. How many of you guys remember watching that on TV? It was a phenomenon in this country. Yeah, whatever. That was that little gleam in your father's eye that you were looking through, right? Yeah. Thanks, Cam. Yeah. I mean, you can watch it on YouTube. They made a movie about it. You can go watch it. It was bedlam. I mean, it was just, they went nuts. Al Michaels was the commentator that year. He's the one who said, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yeah, that's where the Miracle on Ice thing came from. It was craziness. And then just, I mean, icing on the cake or cherry on the sundae, whatever you want to call it, a couple of days later, the U.S. actually beat Finland in the gold medal game. They won the gold medal back in 1980. Big deal. Kind of a cool story. It was voted the greatest sports upset of the 20th century. So that kind of tells you just how David and Goliath that thing was. Now, a lot of people believe that this story of David and Goliath is all about the underdog overcoming insurmountable odds. And, you know, while that's definitely a cool part of that story, that is not the main part of that story. That's not the main point of that story. And we're going to get to that in just a little bit. You guys can go ahead and start heading for 1 Samuel chapter 17 is where we're going to be. That's where the story of David and Goliath is. But I want to give you a little bit of background before we get there, because I always like for things to make sense, kind of set the stage, so you'll understand what's going on when we dive in to part of David's story. We're going to pick up in verse 20 when we get there. So we know that Saul was the first earthly king that Israel had. Unfortunately for him, God ended up rejecting Saul as king, just basically because of his disobedience. It wasn't following God's commands. And so God told the prophet Samuel to go to Bethlehem. There was a guy there by the name of Jesse who had a bunch of boys, and he said, "You're going to go to Jesse's house, and you're going to anoint the guy who is going to become the next king of Israel." So he headed over there, and basically, Jesse starts parading his sons out in front of him. And of course, Samuel saw the oldest boy, big strapping boy. He's like, "Oh yeah, surely, that's the guy right there." And guy's like, "Nope." So it was the second oldest. He paraded him out. It's okay. It's got to be him. Nope. And third and fourth and on down the line. They got through the 7 brothers that David had, and God's like, "No," on every single one of them. And so Samuel's like, "Are there any others?" He says, "Well, the youngest one, he's still out there in the field doing his shepherd thing or whatever." So he's like, "Get him in here." So Samuel, of course, was fooled by the impressive physical appearance of all of these guys, but God told him, he says, "I am looking at what? I'm looking at the heart." That's what God cared about. And so in comes David from the field. God says, "That's my guy right there." So in front of his dad and his brothers, Samuel anoints David, the youngest son of Jesse, to become the next king of Israel. So back to Saul, of course, it said God had rejected Saul. God had removed his spirit from Saul. God even sent an evil spirit to torment Saul. Not happy with this guy at this point. And you can imagine that Saul was not a very fun guy to be around either, because his attendants actually suggested that they bring somebody in who could play the harp to hopefully soothe this guy and calm him down so he wasn't such a jerk all the time and dangerous to be around. And I guess David had a reputation as a musician, because one of the servants knew of his talent, that David played the harp, that he was good at it. So that he's like, "Hey, I know a guy." So Saul sent to Jesse again and said, "Hey, send the boy, tell him to bring his harp." And so he entered into Saul's service. And anytime that the evil spirit would come upon Saul, David would play for him. The evil spirit would leave. Saul would feel better. So he really liked David, so much so that he went back and told Jesse, he says, "I'm just going to keep this guy. I'm going to keep him here. I want him in my service. I need this kid here." The other thing that kind of marked Saul's reign was that he was just almost constantly at war with the Philistines. And that is actually the case where we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel this morning. It's no different. The Israelite army and the Philistine army were encamped on opposing hills with this little valley in between them. And for 40 days, they would come out and do the same ritual every day. They would come out and take up their lines and sit there and just shout at each other and yell their battle cries and all this stuff. And of course, the Philistines had their boy, their champion, the big guy Goliath out there, and he would kind of step forward, and he would every day he would defy Israel's God. Right? He would mock their armies. He would expose them as the cowards that they were, challenging anybody to come out and take him on. Saul was the biggest guy that Israel had, and he wasn't even out there. He was back in his palace. So one day, David's dad gives him a bunch of food and sends him out to where his brothers were. His three oldest brothers were part of the army, fighting for Saul and for Israel. So he told David, take some food, take this to your brothers, go check on them, find out how things are going with the battle, report back to me, let me know. All right, so that's where we're going to pick up. Again, 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 20. We're going to go through 26 here. Early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. So David left his things with the keeper of supplies, and he ran to the battle lines, and he greeted his brothers. And as he was talking with them, Goliath the Philistine, champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines, and he shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from fear. They all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel. So then David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now notice, first of all, go back to verse 20 there where we started. Before David headed out to go find his brothers where the battle was going on, what do we see there? He left the flock with another shepherd. That's an important thing, right? He didn't just bail. He didn't just take off. He didn't just leave his responsibility. He understood how important it was. He already had that caring, nurturing spirit. It was already part of what God was doing in his life out there in that flock. So we get to see our first little glimpse here in this part of the story of David's heart. Right? He cared about those sheep. He took his responsibility seriously. So God chose his next king well, didn't he? And then we see the reward that Saul was offering to anybody who was going to be brave enough to go out and fight Goliath and be fortunate enough to take him out. Right? They were going to get great wealth. They would be rich beyond all measure. He was going to give his daughter to the man to marry, and then he was going to exempt the guy's family from taxes forever. That's a pretty sweet deal. He was obviously desperate, trying to find somebody to get out here and take care of business for Israel. But again, here in this part of the story, we see David's heart, because all the Israelite guys, what were they focused on? They were either focused on the fear and the danger of going out there against this giant and trying to fight this guy, or they were focused on the material wars, focused on like, hey, if somebody could pull this off, you would be set. That's all that they were focused on. What was David focused on? When he was like talking there, he's focused on the reputation of Israel, of God's people, and he's focused on the honor of their God. It's like, this guy is out here defying the nation of Israel who has God on our side. Are you kidding me? What are you guys waiting on? So again, we see David's heart there, focused on the things of God, the things that God cares about. And then David basically starts kind of talking smack about Goliath. And as you saw there, he kind of asked everybody around him, he's like, who does this guy think he is? Right? That he can mock the Israelite army who has God on their side. Well, it didn't take very long for word to get back to Saul that, hey, there's some guy out here like talking like he might be willing to go do this. I mean, he might be the guy. So, Saul got pretty excited and sent for this guy. So we're going to pick up in verse 32, and we're going to go through 37 here. So David is now there with Saul, and David says to Saul in verse 32, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul replied, probably while laughing or maybe crying, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So again, Saul thought he had some good news, thought there was word of some guy that was going to be the man that was going to go out there and take on Goliath. And when David showed up, it turned into a nightmare for him, right? He found out that this smack-talking guy from his army was just some boy who showed up with some food for his brothers just to visit, right? But in trying to convince King Saul to let him go fight Goliath, what does David reference? He references his time in the field. He references his time in the shepherd. He specifically mentions killing both a lion and a bear. I'm impressed. I don't know if you are, but I'm impressed. For a teenage boy to pull something like that off. But did you notice where David's courage came from? Back in the sports world again, your confidence usually comes from winning a game, from winning a match, from having success, right? Stringing some wins together and that type of stuff. But that's not the case for David. Look back at verse 37 again that we just read. He said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Again, we see David's heart, right? Even though his brothers, a little earlier there in verses 28 and 29, his brothers were trying to discourage him. King Saul was trying to discourage him, basically accusing him of being too small, too young, too weak, too everything. David wasn't looking at Goliath. He wasn't looking at any of the other circumstances around him. He solely trusted in the power of God to deliver him from that giant, just like God had delivered him from those wild animals that had attacked his sheep. God chose his next king well, didn't he? So here we go. It's on. David versus Goliath, picking up in verse 40, going through 51. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." You love David's response. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it, struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine, and he killed him. And then David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the scabbard, and after he had killed him, he cut off his head with the sword, just as he said. Again, a lot of people love to use this story as an analogy about the underdog, right? Saying things like, no matter what the odds are, hang in there, you can do it, anything's possible, just believe in yourself. And there's some truth to those sentiments. There's nothing wrong with those sentiments, but again, it's not the true point of this story. The main point of David's story is what God can do through a faithful heart who trusts in him above all else. This is all about faith. And David's relationship with God is what completely altered his outlook on life. That's what gave him the courage when he was facing these massive obstacles, whether it was a lion, whether it was a bear, whether it was a giant, or whether it was anything else in his life. We know there was a lot that he was going to have to deal with when he became king. This is where God was doing all that work and forging him and building him and growing him and his faith. God was looking for a king who would fight for his people and a king who would listen to his voice and fully obey him. That's why Saul was rejected, and that's why God chose David, because of his heart and his passion and his love for the Lord and his obedience. So as we think about this part of David's story this morning, I want you to think back to what we've said. Where did we say that David gained his godly perspective? It was out there in that field, out there in that pasture. Where did we say that he gained his courage? Out there in that field, in that pasture. Where do you think he honed the skills that helped him to be able to sling that stone and defeat that giant? Out there in that field, out there in that pasture. Where do you think he honed the skills that helped him become the king of Israel and to reign well, and to this day still be considered the greatest king that Israel ever had? Out there in that field, out there in that pasture. That's where God did his work, shaping David's shepherding spirit so that he would care for whatever was entrusted to him. That's where he taught David to take responsibility, to take it seriously. Just like he wouldn't leave that flock with a shepherd when he went to go see his brothers. That's where God developed his courage in fighting and killing the lion and the bear. It's where God taught David to trust in him completely for everything, including his very survival. It's where God shaped David's upright and his servant heart during all that time that they had alone out there. It's where he taught David humility and being a lowly shepherd and taking care of sheep. Out there in that pasture is where God forged his faith, built his faith, grew his faith in him. There aren't a lot of people who would have looked at David's upbringing and been jealous of what he had, right? He was a shepherd. I mean, that was one of the lowest positions that you could have back in ancient Israel. It was a despised occupation. Nobody wanted to be a shepherd. But you look at everything that God was able to do in David's life out in that pasture. So here's what I want us to do this morning. I want you to think of your life as a pasture. I want you to remember that God is at work in the pasture that he has placed you in, just like he was with David. Your pasture includes the country that you're fortunate enough to live in, the city that you live in, the neighborhood that you're in. Your pasture includes your family, whatever that may look like. It includes your school. It includes your job. It includes this church. It includes your friends. That's your pasture. That's where God has placed you. And just like he did with David, God is using your pasture where he has put you to forge your character, to develop your gifts, to build your experience, to grow your faith in him, and to teach you how to trust in him completely. That's where all of that's happening, folks. So when you think about your life that way, hopefully you realize that you shouldn't ever despise the pasture that you're in. Sometimes we do, don't we? Right? We shouldn't resent any suffering or any heartache that we have to deal with, because it's all part of the pasture that we've been put in. It's all part of the work that God is doing in our lives. And we certainly shouldn't covet the pasture that somebody else is in. Oh my gosh, do we do that? Grass is always a lot greener in that pasture over from where I'm at right here, right? Man, if I could just do, those folks over there, they never seem to have any problems. Man, how awesome would that be? We just spend all this time looking at everybody else's pasture and bemoaning the one that we're in. When you see it as where God, as the place that God is doing the work in your life that he wants to do, I hope that changes your perspective on your pasture, on where God has you. He has you right where you are for a reason. Many, many reasons. He's molding you. He's shaping you. He's preparing you. He's building your faith. All of those things for everything that he has planned out for your life. So how do we respond this morning? Every time you open up this book, it demands a response, does it not? Every time. So how do we respond? Well, if you're here this morning and you feel like you're in a pasture by yourself, you may know you're in a pasture by yourself. You don't have a relationship with the Good Shepherd. You don't have a Christ who is shepherding you like he did David. That's where you need to start this morning. You need a relationship with the Good Shepherd. You need somebody that makes sense out of your pasture. You need somebody that can give you a purpose, that can give you a future. Somebody that can give you hope. You need a relationship with Jesus Christ. And he is ready and willing to become your Lord, to take over, to take control, to start guiding you and leading you. All you have to do is believe in his name and invite him into your life this morning. And you can do that while you're here. In just a minute, I'm going to have everybody bow. And I just invite you to come down here and let me know. I need a good shepherd. I need a relationship with him. I need him in my pasture. And we can take care of that this morning. And you can walk out of here a changed person with a hope and a future and a purpose. For the rest of you that are here this morning, you already know the Good Shepherd. You already have a relationship with him. I'm going to issue you a challenge this morning. And this isn't easy. Regardless of what you think your pasture looks like right now, I want you to thank God that you're there. Thank God that he has put you in the pasture that you're in. Again, I'm going to tell you, you're there for a reason. I don't care what anybody else's pasture looks like. He's put you where you are on purpose. So regardless of what you think your pasture looks like this morning, I'm going to challenge you in just a minute when we pray to thank God for the pasture that he has put you in, and then let him shepherd you. Sometimes we forget that part. He wants to mold and shape and prepare and grow your faith for all the things that he has planned out for your life. Folks, we can trust that God can use everything that happens in your pasture for your good. He can. And he wants to. We have to let him. But he's there. And he's ready. And that's what he wants to do. So this is how we're going to close this morning. I'm just going to have you bow your heads, close your eyes. If you already have a relationship with the Good Shepherd this morning, thank God for the pasture that he has you in. And ask him to help you not to miss why he has you there. And if you need a relationship with the Good Shepherd this morning, you come down here and let me know. And we can help with that too.